When I recently started Carnivore again, I noticed something different because each time I relapse and give in to carbs, I try to figure out why or how it happened. And for the longest time, I focused on the cravings and urges and then strategized on how to handle them successfully by resisting them. I then learned how to not judge those cravings and urges, to not put too much pressure on myself, because that ultimately would lead to a cheat meal. But eventually, I always failed, would beat myself up and try again. However, this last time I decided to journal the entire experience, not just the cravings, urges, and emotions, but also my behavior beyond the successful resistance of the urges. For example, if I had a craving for something sweet and my urge is to get up and check the fridge and I don't do it, what do I do after resisting the fridge? Because usually I'd stop journaling the situation after writing down the win, didn't check the fridge. Then I'd go about my business. But now I was going beyond that point. So after doing this for just one day, I found the culprit of why I would always eventually relapse with a cheat meal. If this is resonating with you already, pause for a second and click the link below and join the Carnivore Labs community. Absolutely free, where we're all about fixing fatigue, addiction, and blood sugar without gimmicks, willpower, or calorie counting. Just science, nutrition, and a system that works. A private community of men where you don't have to explain yourself and have the freedom and support to experiment with your own struggles, like I do. After resisting the fridge, for example, I'd go to the TV and binge on YouTube videos. From there, I'd do some mobile gaming on my phone. Then I'd scroll on Instagram for a while. I realized this wasn't just me battling carbs. It was something much bigger, and why it was so difficult sticking to carnivore. It was the cumulative effects of dopamine. It wasn't about the individual habit itself. It was an overstimulated dopaminergic system. So, I went from using carbs to distract me from my internal pain and discomfort to using other dopaminergic stimuli to distract me from the pain and discomfort of not having carbs. That's why I couldn't stop. It's a vicious cycle of climbing high on the dopamine ladder and falling hard. And all these dopamine spikes were compounding over the days and weeks, reinforcing the addiction I was trying to control. Because beef and eggs didn't hit like the dopamine spike I'd get from carbs. So that gap in dopamine had to get satisfied by something. So I'd scroll or hit up Marvel Strike Force on my phone. But those can only distract me for so long because the carbs are an addiction. So the scrolling and gaming don't hit like a peanut butter and jelly low-carb tortilla wrap. So I'd eventually give in. All right, now don't get me wrong. Dopamine isn't bad. In fact, it's necessary for survival. But just as too much water can unalive you, too much dopamine can destroy your life and the lives of others around you. Dopamine is what gets us out of bed, why we go to work, why we pursue a partner, why we protect our family. It's the brain's way of saying, this matters, do it again. So the problem isn't dopamine itself. The problem is the overstimulation of dopamine. And that can easily be achieved with the cumulative effects of too many dopamine triggers stacked together. You can think of them like volume sliders in a recording studio. One slider is carbs, another is porn, another is caffeine, another is YouTube, another is Instagram or TikTok. One slider on high can already be hard to deal with. But when you turn up all 5 or 6 at the same time, the system gets distorted. The sound isn't music anymore, it's noise. Even if you're not doing everything at once, there's a carryover effect from one stimulus to another in terms of dopamine levels. That's the brain on modern life, constant noise. And when the signal is too loud, the brain adapts. The dopamine receptors down-regulate. They're trying to protect the brain cells, which means now you need more stimulation just to hear anything at all. That's tolerance. That's craving. That's the endless cycle. Now, as I mentioned, the piece I missed is when dopamine spikes, it's always followed by a crash below baseline. So when I resisted carbs, avoided the fridge, I'd crash and head to some YouTube videos for a quick dopamine fix. Neurobiologists call this the opponent process. It means the higher you go, the harder you fall, as I mentioned before. You wake up, check your phone, dopamine spike. You then have a cup of tea or coffee with caffeine, dopamine spike. You have some processed carbs for breakfast, dopamine spike. You scroll through YouTube for a while, dopamine spike. And this is just in the morning and can go on all day. Sitting at a light, check the phone. Sitting on the toilet, scroll on the phone. Laying in bed to go to sleep, scroll on the phone. So through all of this, when we try to stop an addiction, let's say we want to cut out carbs, like I struggle to do, we end up craving a dopaminergic stimulus because the brain doesn't care which one it is. It just wants relief from the pain of being in a dopamine deficit. For example, not eating carbs when I'm hungry. This, by the way, is why we have to be careful not to fill that gap too often with another dopaminergic stimulus, because we could then create another addiction to replace that one. This is how I started my carb addiction. I'd used carbs to cope with not having a cigarette back when I quit smoking. So, going back to the dopamine baseline, over time, these dips below baseline accumulate. Your normal becomes lower than it used to be. The system that once made you motivated and excited about your day or spending quality time with your family is now dragging you down. This is why you feel flat or restless, why discipline feels impossible, why no amount of motivation hacks seem to stick. Now, here's where we add the psychology to reinforce what we know about dopamine. Joseph Nguyen, in his book, Don't Believe Everything You Think, makes a simple but powerful distinction. Thoughts versus thinking. A thought is just raw data. There's a bag of chips on the counter, for example. Thinking is when you grab that thought and build a story around it. Man, I can't resist chips. I've always been weak. One bag won't hurt. Screw it. I'll start tomorrow. I'm going through too much right now anyway. I don't have time for this. The suffering doesn't come from the thought. It comes from the thinking. And when your dopamine system is depleted, your brain leans on thinking even more because your mind is trying to convince you to get the next hit. And if you're someone with a religious background, as I am, we even have the devil whispering to us to have some because he's our open enemy and wants nothing but destruction for us, both physically and spiritually. So we know this mental chatter too well. Just one more. I'll quit after the weekend or holidays. Nobody will know. Or if I don't get some now, I'll miss out, which is FOMO. Or one that gets me, what's it going to hurt? It's not like I'll be visibly fatter if I eat some. You think you're reasoning. You're not. You're rationalizing under the influence of dopamine debt and this internal dialogue of thinking, which means willpower isn't the solution. Awareness is. Eckhart Tolle, in his book, The Power of Now, said it plainly. You are not your thinking. Most of your misery doesn't come from reality. It comes from being lost in the compulsive thinking about reality. You're not actually suffering from carbs. You're suffering from the thought loop about carbs. You're not actually suffering from porn. You're suffering from the guilt, shame, and anticipation surrounding it. When you step back and watch the urge instead of fusing with it, you create a gap. Neuroscience calls this metacognition. Toll calls it presence. Whatever you call it, that gap is freedom. You build strength through that moment of abstinence that's causing restlessness and boredom because the ego and urge can't survive when being observed. It survives by you being on autopilot. Okay, now, let's talk about this sober diet. Most men think they can fix their addictions while keeping carbs in the mix. But here's the truth. Carbs are the keystone stimulus. When you eat carbs, blood sugar spikes, insulin spikes, dopamine spikes. Then you crash. Cravings roar back, and then you binge. Or as many like to call it, like I've said, you have a cheat meal. That cycle is the same loop as alcohol, porn, or scrolling, just in edible form. That's why a carnivore diet can be thought of as the sober diet. Meat and its associated fat doesn't spike dopamine the same way carbs do. No roller coaster, no crash, no cravings. And I've found for myself that when I'm doing carnivore and I'm mindful of the dopamine gap, the boredom, I develop more impulse control and urges with other things, the scrolling, gaming, etc. Because when you cut the carbs, you'll find that suddenly your brain isn't chasing the next hit all day while also suffering from a blood sugar crash, which, by the way, can mimic anxiety. You now have the bandwidth to tackle the other habits, the caffeine, the streaming, the scrolling. And that's why in Carnivore Labs, we start with food, because food isn't just fuel, it's leverage. And of course, if you're addicted to carbs like me, then carnivore is an absolute must because there's no moderation with an addiction. Abstinence is king. I used to think I'm too old to change. I'm now in my 50s, so it's easy to think that I'm set in my ways. As they say, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But one of the most important things addiction science has discovered is this: change is possible at any stage, whether it's age or whether you're dealing with an addiction. So you don't have to be in your 20s. You don't have to hit rock bottom. You don't have to wait until your marriage collapses or your health falls apart. Although for many, that's what finally gets them on the wagon. The brain is plastic. It rewires, it heals. And the fastest way to begin that healing is to remove the constant dopamine fire hose. Eliminate carbs, cut back on caffeine, reduce screen time, abstain from porn, dopamine and motivation reset. Piece by piece, the baseline comes back. Motivation returns naturally. Discipline isn't forced, it's restored. Dr. Anna Lemke, a well-known addiction expert and psychiatrist, says in her experience with patients, it takes about 30 days for the dopamine or pain and pleasure balance to restore homeostasis, aka balance. Now let's go back to mindfulness for a second and give you a metaphor that might help make it more clear. Nguyen tells the story of the empty boat. A monk is meditating in a small boat in the middle of a calm lake when another boat drifts into him. Startled and interrupted, he feels this anchor rise. He turns to give the other person a quick lesson in paying attention when he notices the boat is empty. He then quickly calms down because there's no one to blame. That's how cravings and urges work. The food isn't attacking you. Porn isn't plotting against you. Your phone isn't trying to ruin your life. They're just empty boats. It's not the urge itself. It's your reaction, your thinking, your emotions that creates the suffering. And here's the power in that. When you see the urge as an empty boat, the anger, shame, and self-loathing dissolve. Suddenly the craving isn't a command, it's a signal. All that's left is awareness. And with awareness, you get back what addiction stole from you, the freedom of choice. This is where Carnivore Labs comes in. Because knowing all this is one thing, living it is another. That's why I built the Carnivore Labs system around 4 pillars. The first is diet. Carnivore is the sober diet, removing dopamine spikes at the root. The second is technology, tracking urges, triggers, behavior, and progress. So data is in your face, not in the shadows floating around in your mind. The third is psychology, applying awareness practices, thought versus thinking, and presence of mind to give you back free will and choice. And the fourth is support, an empathetic community of men where you don't have to explain yourself. This isn't theory. This is what pulled me out of prediabetes, anxiety, and panic disorder, and it's now pulling me out of a carb addiction. Look, you don't need more hacks. You don't need more motivational quotes. You don't need another 30-day challenge. You need to lower the total dopamine load on your system. Start with food. Cut the carbs. Eat meat. Then cut the other stimuli, one by one. Don't take on too much at once. You'll shock your system and put your brain in fight or flight mode. Rebuild from a steady baseline. Slowly. This is how men reclaim discipline. This is how men rebuild health. This is how men live with energy, clarity, and focus again. So if you're ready to take the next step and get serious, join us at Carnivore Labs. It's where I break this down step by step. Diet, psychology, tracking, and most importantly, a community of support so you can actually follow through and stick to it. Click the link below, join the tribe, and start rebuilding your health and discipline today, because you don't need willpower to change. You just need the right system and support. Click the link below, and I'll see you there. Peace.